Welcome to Colonie TV, the governmental educational channel for the town of Colonie.
Thanks a lot. Good to be with everyone today. As you just heard, I'm the director of the Siena College Research Institute. So usually when I have a chance to speak to a group of people, one of the first things I always ask is whether or not we've ever called you up and asked you to take one of our surveys. So just a quick show of hands, have we ever called you up? Okay, a couple of people. Oh, there's, all right. So now the rest of you have to raise your right hand now. Come on. It's participatory. And promise that if we do call you, whether it's a dinner time or whatever, that you will take the survey. Thank you very much. I appreciate that. Well, I'm a boomer. How many boomers are here? Okay, quite a few. I'm scanning the audience. I'm not sure if I see any millennials. So if you're between 18 and 34, you qualify as a millennial. So that'll give us an opportunity as either boomers or those of you who are not boomers, that generation that was born prior to 1946 is often referred to now as the silent generation. The silence. So I don't know if you like that term, but that's how you're referred to. So I was assuming that when I came here that the boomers would at least have the millennials outnumbered, but it appears as though we're going to be able to talk about them without them being able to voice their opinion. So let me tell you just very, very briefly about what it's like to be a pollster, and then let me dive into to Taylor's book. Did anybody get a chance to look at it? Okay, a couple people know. All right. Well, Paul Taylor is one of the principals at the Pew Research Center, which is a national polling organization that conducts not only political polls, but they really do tremendous work in social and cultural polling, measuring the behavior of Americans as well as their attitudes. And those of us at a place like the Siena College Research Institute, where our polling is primarily New York State. That's our bailiwick. That's who we are interested in. That's the issue that we seek to measure. So we seek to measure, whereas Pew is looking at the United States of America. They actually, in fact, now do some global polling as well. Our area of interest is the state of New York. Oftentimes people hear about us primarily with our political polling. So we are constantly polling New York State voters as to their attitudes towards the upcoming elections, whether you agree or disagree with the actions being taken by the governor, the legislature, how you stand on issues of the day, and we're publishing that on a regular basis, whether you look at our website, the local news, or various newspapers. We oftentimes partner with any number of different media outlets around the state. Times Union here locally. We work a great deal with the New York Times. For the past year and a half, we've been working with the New York Times, polling things like the recent mayoral election in the city, those of you who follow the issues of New York City. We also do a great deal of polling in partnership with Newsday. So if you have friends, relatives on the island, we regularly poll politics and social and cultural behavior and attitudes on the island. Additionally, oftentimes people hear about us because we have since 1999 been polling consumer confidence here in the state of New York. So each and every month we publish how you feel as to your willingness to spend in the marketplace. And those numbers become very important and well-traveled, well-used numbers for various financial entities. We also do what I would call social and cultural polling. And Joe mentioned a little bit of that. I'm a sociologist by training, and so I'm interested in what makes people tick. What are we interested in? What do we do with our time? What do we think is important in our lives? So we poll about things that are seemingly as mundane as how important is the consumption of sports to you as a person, as a family, within your relationships. We poll, for example, the use of technology. To what degree do you now use technology that you never even imagined was going to exist 30 or 40 years ago? We poll things like the division of labor within families. Who takes out the garbage? Who pays the bills? How do you negotiate those things? How do you decide how to feed your family? Who does the provisioning? So we want to understand what makes New Yorkers tick. So let's do a quick couple of poll questions here just to get you warmed up, okay? Let's try an easy one. Show of hands, how many people are carrying a cell phone with them today? Okay, looks like a decided majority. Of those people who are carrying a cell phone, how many of those are carrying what would be called a smartphone? Okay, it's internet accessible, can take pictures. Okay, Facebook accounts? Okay, we're declining a little bit. Regular users of Twitter? Okay, getting less. Pinterest? Couple. Okay, now if we had a room full of millennials, we might see slightly different statistics than we just witnessed. Okay? All right, let's try another one. Let's go back about 36 years, okay? I'm going to give you permission to travel back in time 36 years to the year 1978. Why do I pick 1978? Because 36 years from now will be 2050. That's a nice round number. I remember 1978, it's the year I got married. So what I want you to think of is become the person you were in 1978. Picture where you lived, who you were associated with, what you were doing. And I want you to think of one thing that had I asked you in 1978 for a prediction of something that would have come true in America by the year 2014, what would that be? So if I talked to you 36 years ago and I gave you a chance for you to tell me something that absolutely, with total certainty, you're sure would have occurred over the following 36 years. So in 2014, it would have been true without a shadow of a doubt. What might that be? Yes?
We would have a woman president.
Woman president, absolutely. Wouldn't a lot of people have said that in 1978? How could we not have had a woman president 36 years in the future at that point? Absolutely. Anything else? Yes?
World War III.
World War III would have happened. A positive thought, yes. Joe? Electric car. Yeah, how about some technology issues? I'm sure everyone predicted in 1978 that we would have an internet, right? And that you would be able to, in the privacy of your home, on a personal computer, or on a device that could fit in your pocket and you would walk around with, that you could be in immediate contact with virtually every human being that you know, those that you don't know, that you would get instantaneous information about all news items that were taking place anywhere in the world. Everybody foresaw that, right? You knew that was coming.
No.
How about energy? What do you think was the energy? If I had asked you, what were we going to use for energy? To heat our homes, to supply the fuel for transportation. Anybody think we were going to be living like the Jetsons? You know, somebody might have said that in 1978, right? Anybody go to the other side and predict that maybe we would have solved it, right? We would have had some combination of wind, solar. We would have, safely harnessed nuclear, and that we would be all set, living in this futuristic Shangri-La. Nobody in 1978 believed that we as boomers, as we came to age, given that we knew that our parents were totally screwed up, that we were going to solve the world's problems. How about racism? Were we going to solve racism? In 1978, if I had asked you, do you think that we would still have a society with jagged racial divisions 36 years in the future? Would any of you have predicted that we would have been beyond that by 2014? We believed, some of us anyways, would have believed that we would have moved beyond, the women's movement would have been like a historic event, right? And there would have been gender equity, equal pay, that we would have successfully moved beyond a racially divided society. How about poverty, right? Remember the war on poverty? 1964, we declared war on poverty. Wouldn't we expect that we could have perhaps solved it in the greatest country in the world? So, I ask you to engage in this thought exercise because in some ways that's the most disappointing and simultaneously provocative part of Paul Taylor's book. Because what Taylor does in this book is lay out through Pew's data, which is beyond extensive, a picture of who we are, how we are living, and how the way we are living and who we are is changing. And it's left to us to decide what are we going to not necessarily look like, because it does a pretty good job of describing what we're going to look like by 2050. But who are we going to be is a much more provocative question. Who are we going to be 36 years from today? So now we just went back and we see how difficult a question that is. Because we take a couple seconds and try to go back 36 years and say, who do we think we would have been going back at that point in time? I mean, one thing that finally has become everyday discussion is, of course, the legalization of marijuana. And we're going to talk in a couple seconds here about the differences between how boomers have attitudes towards that question and how millennials do. But I think that if we had asked many people in 1978, do you think that marijuana will be legal in the United States in the year 2014, we would have had an overwhelming percentage who would have said, yes, I think by then it'll be legal. And that's another issue that now only in the last couple years has suddenly we've seen an accelerating change in public attitudes towards that question. Okay, so Taylor in this book, which is a little bit dry, this is, if you're having a little trouble getting to sleep at night, because it's jam-packed with the kind of stuff that I do. Numbers and more numbers, graphs and charts. And if you like graphs and charts and numbers, you're going to eat it up. But it is the type of book that you can pick it up and read 5 pages. And start to think of like the underlying questions. So I recommend it for that. So Taylor says, is America changing? Is America changing? Well, America's always been changing, right? But he goes a little bit deeper than that, and he asks, are the boomers and the millennials different? Are they truly different groups of people? Or are they simply just at different stages? In other words, are the current millennials going to grow into the same people in 30 or 40 years as the boomers are today? It's just stages of life, or are they actually different people? And he tries to open up the question as that we just dealt with a little bit, that being, will America be a different place in 20, 30, 36 years? And then he goes on to ask a question that I think is political. It's socially provocative. And it really is a question that I think each of us within our own lives and families are going to come to grips with. And that being, is there a looming crisis? Is there a showdown between these two generations? Are we going to have a cooperative existence between boomers as boomers move into retirement and an older age that's going to extend quite long? is there going to be a cooperative or an adversarial relationship between those boomers and the current millennials? Yeah. Kind of work our way through them a little bit through Paul Taylor's eyes, and we're all going to walk out of here with our own opinions. This is sort of like my wife is a teacher. Any teachers here? And whenever we go to a social gathering, you know, the thing about teachers, everybody thinks they're an expert in teaching because everybody went to school. So this is about life. So we're all experts in generational relationships, in stereotypic opinions of not only our own generation but others. So we're all experts in all this stuff. So what will the next America be like? But I think that where Taylor, I won't say fails because it's just too desperately difficult. And what I think he leaves us to ponder is, as I've tried to point out, not necessarily what will we look like, but what will we be like. So let's see if we can work through it a little bit. Part of the reason that question is so difficult is that while we would all agree that America is always changing, evolving, developing, let's pull it apart a little bit. Why is that the case? And I would argue that is the case because who we are, what we are like, is a function of the intersection of a series of different aspects of our world. What Taylor does a really good job of describing our demography. Who lives here? And that's an important ingredient that we need to describe who we are now, how do we get to this place, what are we going to look like? Demography. So we know who lives here now. We know that we're fighting a battle currently over immigration, but even holding that battle aside for right now, we know that there have been waves of immigration in our country. The most recent wave of immigration from 1965 to the present has 50% of those immigrants, 50% of the people who have come to our nation in the last 50 years are Hispanic, 50%. Now, in the wave of immigration that I trace my entry to this country, the wave of immigration that took place between 1890 and 1920, anybody else have a family of origin that came to the United States during those years? Okay. Everybody else was on the Mayflower? Okay, but no, there was another wave in the middle of the 19th century. The first great wave was in the middle of the 19th century. Anybody trace their lineage to that? Okay. I mean, that was Northern European. Germans, Irish were the largest group of people who came to the United States during the middle of the 19th century. Significant percentage of Eastern Europeans came to this country during the 1890 to 1920 immigration, but still overwhelmingly European. 88% of the immigrants to this nation during the second wave of immigration were from Europe. Now 50% are Hispanic, from either Mexico or South America or Latin America. So it's a different group of people that are coming here. But we've always had different groups of people come here. And we have assimilated or become a different mosaic based on that in-migration. So who we are, what we look like, who we will be, is a function of our demography, who lives here. It's also a function of our culture. How do we live? What do we do each and every day? How do we organize our relationships? How do we organize our families? What do we do as our behavior? What are our interests? What sort of information do we assimilate? Now, some of us in this room remember when, for example, we got a lot of our cultural information exclusively for, anybody remember when the radio was the primary vehicle of information? Okay? Remember when a television was brand new? Remember when that was sort of cool, you know, we got a television set. How about the advent of color television? Okay? I think everybody in this room predates the fax machine. Remember when the fax machine came out? How did they do that, right? It's amazing. Okay, those are aspects of our culture. Our religious behavior is an aspect of our culture. And Taylor does a good job of pointing out in this book that we are progressively becoming a more secular nation. Whereas in the early days of our culture, The church was the focal point, the nexus of the lives of so many people, of so many communities. Communities tended to be more homogeneous. People were more the same within a community. Now we are not only secular, but we are more heterogeneous. We live next to people, we work with people, we socialize with people who may look different than us, who may go to a different religious facility, or may not go to any religious facility at all. Our culture changes. And to predict what our culture is going to look like in 35 years, we just went through this exercise. We have no idea. We have no idea. We know that this thing here is going to have a role in it. What this thing here is going to look like in 36 years, we can't even imagine. And there's copious materials written on how, for example, Facebook is changing the culture of America. Think of your own family. I grew up in a family where all my relatives lived within 10 minutes of one another. It was common in my childhood for my uncles, my aunts, my cousins, my grandparents to drop by on Sunday afternoon, and that was what we did. That was our family culture. Now, my immediate family, my children, live across the entire country. We communicate through this. Skype, FaceTime. It's a different culture. What we do for a living, our job, define us in a certain way, right? But that's part of our culture. There are jobs that we all do today that did not exist a generation or 2 generations ago. And of course, there are jobs that were central to our culture then that either have been outsourced or done away with. What are the jobs? What are the lives going to be 36 years from today? Very difficult to predict. How about our politics? That's a third bit. So demography defines who we are, culture defines who we are, politics, okay? The battle over power in our society. Who gets to say what we do, what our laws are, what is right, what is wrong, and how governmentally our resources are going to be allocated. Okay? Currently, most of us argue, and I spend a lot of time in the political realm. Most of us, I think, would tend to agree that we are frustrated with our politics currently. We're frustrated. Whether you typically vote Republican or you vote Democrat or you've given up voting, most Americans will agree that they are frustrated. I'd like to see more results. And just quantitatively, and I'm a quantoid, we know that this most recent Congress enacted less legislation than any Congress in the history of the United States of America. Okay? That's our political system right now. What's it going to look like? How long can we go on like this? What's it going to look like in 36 years? Will we still just have 2 parties? Is there going to be a third party, a fourth party? Will our republic still be here? Will we have merged with other nations, right? It was beyond our comprehension that Europe would do this weird thing where they'd all merge their currency. And everybody been to Europe lately? It's a different place. What are we going to look like? Are we going to have the same political system or not? If you bring it down just to the current level, same-sex marriage, abortion, immigration, education. And I'm not even touching yet with war, Social Security. What are we going to do? Healthcare. We've been in this healthcare quagmire now. Pick the date. For 20 years? Or do you want to say it just started with the recent healthcare reform legislation? We know it takes up 20% of our economy. We know that as we age, we're concerned with it. We want that system to do a good job. Yes, sir.
We do know Some things. I mean, some things are unpredictable. We never would have predicted 36 years ago. We can't predict 36 years from now. But some things are facts. We, quite a while back, were number 1, 2, 3 in the world in science and math and those subjects. In fact, we're 30th now. And if that continues, I don't know where we're going to be.
So we're concerned.
In 5 years.
Right.
Now, even now.
Right. And so we're, in terms of our political realm, education is now a political issue. And I think it's an area, again, that many of us are frustrated. We have a new Common Core. I don't know if you've spent a lot of time following that, the use of testing within our schools. But yeah, again, we're frustrated. We're frustrated that we spend as much as we do on education, and we seem to be falling behind at an accelerating rate. Okay, so we've got our demography, our culture, our politics. How about our economy? Our economy determines who we are. We live in a different economy than we used to. We live in a global economy. And, the way capital works, capital moves to its most efficient use, and because of that dictum of capitalism, which is our economic system, then it makes sense that capital traveled to find cheaper labor. The effect on us is that many people who used to be able to get a high school degree and get a job that was able to support a middle-class existence within our country and have sufficient resources to acquire all the consumer goods, which in turn fed the economic system, is running out of gas. We face challenges as to building a new economy. And we've been stuck now in what was a deep recession and now has been a stalled recovery for several years. And what drives us crazy, right, that we watch the stock market at record highs, and so our pensions are doing well, and our investments are doing well, but the ability of consumers, and millennials are a really good example of this, to acquire goods and services is restricted. Yes?
I'd just like to add to your description of our economic woes is that very few people have pensions anymore.
Yes.
Especially in the privates, people who are employed in the private sector.
Certainly one of the transitions that we have seen of late is the movement from a defined benefit to a defined contribution. And we're in the adolescence of that change, and we don't know yet the effect that it's going to have upon us. We know we're worried about it. And certainly when we're talking about the economy, let me just finish this one thought and I'll get to you. An issue that, of course, Taylor spends a great deal of time thinking about as he moves then into describing this looming generational showdown is Social Security. It's a system that has been wildly successful, that has provided a safety net for seniors since its beginnings in the 1930s. And now, of course, we know that the system is challenged. And depending on which set of numbers you want to read, headed towards insolvency, and poses the greatest threat to this relationship economically between boomers and millennials. And we're going to talk about that a little bit more in a couple minutes. Yes?
I'm always puzzled that people are surprised that we're doing so poorly economically. We just had the worst financial meltdown, worst economic meltdown since the Great Depression. So why is it a big surprise that it's taking us longer and it's much harder to get out from under that than it is, say, garden variety recessions that we've had in the more recent past? Certainly this would be expected if you had the kind of economic cataclysm that we suffered in 2007 and 2008. And just another point on Social Security, it just seems to me that health care is much more immediately a problem than Social Security, which is a problem, but it's not nowhere near the cost problem that health care, providing for health care is.
Let me try to move through but actually good points. So these five, I've worked through four of the areas that determine who we are: our demography, our culture, our politics, our economy. A sort of wild card in who we are and who we will become is technology. And significant advances in technology have changed us again and again and again. Whether it was, if you want to go back to the printing press, the railroad, the car, pick whichever are your favorites. But the current technological revolution that we're in the midst of and what it will give birth to will change us, and will change us in ways that we still can't quite predict. So those are five areas that interact with one another, intersect with one another. And against that backdrop of a current demography, current history, we have these two generations, the millennials and the boomers. And that's what Taylor tries to then concentrate on. And within our current historic moment, within his ability then to describe who we are going to become demographically, what our current politics are, what our current economic situation is, he makes some projections about what the relationship, both on a family level, a personal level, and a social level, is going to be the dynamic between these two generations. So who are they? Boomers, looks like many boomers amongst us, born 1946 to 1964 approximately, ranging in age from about 50 to 68 today. Now boomers right now control 80% of personal financial assets in our country. More than half of consumer spending. Boomers consume 77% of all prescription drugs, and 80% of leisure travel. Now you think back, boomers grew up during a time of dramatic social change, obviously. We can remember those times: Vietnam War, counterculture, civil rights, women's rights. But starting in the 1980s, based on public opinion polling, boomers became progressively more conservative in their personal, social, and political views. Still, 42%, nearly half of boomers, would describe themselves, according to Pew, as dropouts from organized religion. So boomers have become less involved in organized religion. As we pointed out a few minutes ago, they're the first generation to grow up with television. The generation prior to boomers did not grow up with television. Now, when I ask college students, one of the questions I always ask is, how many televisions do you have in your home? And oftentimes, they describe having far more televisions in their home than there are human beings. Memorable events that boomers experienced, things like the Cuban Missile Crisis, the assassination of John F. Kennedy, the assassination of Martin Luther King, the Vietnam War, landing on the moon, Woodstock, Watergate, the Nixon years, gasoline shortage. That's part of the thumbprint of history on boomers. As I read that list, every single one of us could picture where I was, what I thought, how I felt during each and every one of those events. And boomers oftentimes, though, are described as being self-centered. I don't know if you feel that way. In my honest moments, I'll describe myself as self-centered. Another aspect that boomers are often described with is unprepared for retirement. You see, and Taylor writes this. He writes, boomers reveled in their youth and idealism. They were the world's change agents. In some realms, they've succeeded. In others, life has gotten in the way. But whatever the final score, this much is clear. A generation famous for being young ain't young no more. And it's a bummer. So whether or not, as a boomer, you accept that or not, that's up to you. But that's Taylor's description of sort of the angst of the moment for boomers. All right, how about millennials? Now, many of you who describe yourselves as boomers probably have millennials in your family. They may or may not still live with you. They were born between the early 80s and the early 2000s. They're anywhere from as young as 14 to 34. So except for the lingering teenagers, they're young adults. They're in their 20s. They're in their young 30s. They tend to be far more detached from institutions, yet they're far more networked with their friends. Yes, sir.
What about the in-between, the Gen Y?
The Gen Xers? Yeah.
In between the boomers
Right.
and the millennials.
It's certainly a subject for another entire talk, which I'm not going to focus on today because I'm going to try to do Taylor his justice and focus on these two bookend generations. But we'll put that one in the parking lot, and if you want to invite me back sometime, I'll come back and talk about the Xers. Interesting, millennials, when you poll them, are more upbeat about the future for they personally and for our society than are boomers and silents. Could be a function of their age. They're hopeful. And that's interesting, especially given the fact that they have, as a group of people, high level of indebtedness, high levels of student debt for many of them, high unemployment, high underemployment. In their 20s and early 30s, as a group, of course there are many, many exceptions, but as a group, they're not doing as well as boomers were at that age. They responding to technological and economic implications of the internet. We boomers were the first people to grow up with television. They grew up with the internet. Oftentimes we describe boomers as immigrants to technology, whereas millennials are natives. And if any of you have the next generation, kids, in walking through your home who are now 7, 8, 9, 11, 12, and you've turned to them and asked them to explain to you how to do something on your computer, then you've seen the next generation who speak that language intuitively. It's nothing to them. It's a different culture. Now, I will put one caveat, and I don't want to spend a lot of time with this. Taylor's book has a little bit of a bias. By and large, Taylor's writing from this perspective of middle and upper class, and he tends to ignore to some extent some differences that exist in lower income folks when he makes these broad, sweeping descriptions of boomers vis-a-vis millennials. Still, he goes on to describe millennials as more liberal on social issues, and in part, that's sort of the impetus for some of the recent changes we've seen in public opinion on issues like same-sex marriage, for example, medical marijuana, for example. That's generated by these millennials starting to become of age and taking political positions. Still, these millennials face very difficult economic prospects. The fact that they are underemployed, unemployed, in some cases through their 20s, into their 30s, they're losing earning power both personally and boomers as contributors to our collective retirement system. At the same time, we boomers, because we're worried, are working older and not relinquishing our positions to either the Xers or the millennials. So we're creating, due to our recession, a bit of a quagmire. In some cases, our millennials now are referred to as either the boomerang generation, right? That being a description of them going to college, going on the word for a little while, doesn't work out, and boom, they're back at home. They boomerang. At the same time, some people describe them, and Taylor does this, and he says that they're more like the Peter Pan generation. And that's a description of their hesitancy to engage in components of life that boomers did during their 20s. They're getting married later. They're having children later. They're not terribly surprised by the fact that they don't really have a career late into their 20s, on into their early 30s to some extent. They're staying young longer. and that's a whole nother discussion as to whether the manner in which boomers raised the millennials, in effect, kept them young longer. You know, you hear that a lot, and Taylor discusses that a bit, that they became old sooner and stayed young longer, all at the same time. One of the explanations that often is cited is that the millennials are reluctant to get married and are delaying that to some extent because they witnessed some of the problems that boomers had with that relationship and the high rate of unhappiness and divorce that they witnessed. Whether or not that's true, you can decide. Okay, are they different politically? Do they feel differently? Do they believe different things? Do they have different attitudes, the millennials versus the boomers? A couple of things from our polls. Now, this is New York State data. Simple questions. I'll get you in 1 second, sir. Simple question that we ask in every single poll. Do you think New York State is on the right track or is headed in the wrong direction? It's the first question in a poll. It's a general political economic question. How do you feel about the way things are going?
What's the answer?
Well, the answer is that millennials, a majority of millennials, a decided majority, feel as though things are on the right track. 58% right track, 32% wrong direction. Boomers are break even. It's a big swing. It's almost a 17-point swing in each direction.
Would be the other way.
How about a simple question like, do you want to re-elect the governor or not? You know, as we sit today, would you like to would you vote to re-elect Andrew Cuomo, or would you prefer someone else? We're not even in this question positing Rob Astorino, just somebody else, anybody else. Millennials, a plurality would like to see someone else. 49 to 42, millennials would like to see someone else other than Andrew Cuomo. Boomers, a decided majority say that they would re-elect Andrew Cuomo, 57-34. Radically different numbers. Whether you agree, disagree, radically different numbers. How about one like recreational marijuana? Not even talking about medical marijuana, recreational marijuana like they have now in Colorado. Would you support or oppose that here in New York? Boomers actually right now are break even. 46% would support it, 48% would oppose. So boomers are kind of on the fence. Millennials, listen to this one, 63% of millennials would support the legalization of recreational marijuana. Only 35% of millennials oppose. Yes, sir.
So I've been waiting for you to say the numbers, and not these numbers, but I'm curious, how many are there? Because I just heard on the news that the largest group of Americans are 22 years old, and that shocked me. Next to that, the second most common age I heard was 23, followed by 21, followed by 53, which indicates to me that the boomers are now in the minority. Is that true?
You know, I don't have those exact numbers at my fingertips. What I will say is that a number that demographers look like is two different things. One is the replacement rate. Are we replacing ourselves as a society, or are we falling short of replacement? And right now we are replacing at a 1-to-1 ratio. So overall, for every person who passes away, we're replacing with either a birth or an in-migration. Robust societies operate at a greater than 1-to-1 replacement rate.
Correct, but that doesn't address this specific issue. You can replace with as many of these new kids as you want. They're the new kids. The question is, are the millennials essentially the largest voting bloc in the country, as opposed to the boomers or the Xers or the Yers or the silent generation or the golden generation, or are essentially the millennials now the most powerful voting force in the whole country, and one might wonder, in the entire world?
Mm-hmm. Well, again, I don't have that exact number. In terms of who votes, which is a slightly different question, of course, they are not, right? So they simply do not turn out to the polls at a rate even close to what either the silents are the best voters as far as a percentage of themselves. The boomers are second, so it moves with age. And the millennials are really poor at voting. In some elections, they vote at no more than 40% of their capability. So they have not as yet, in overall elections, expressed their power. One of the great victories of the Obama campaign was that they succeeded in generating enthusiasm, especially in the first Obama election, of that group and getting them to turn out. Less so the second time. And again, I mean, it's a whole nother conversation about the how of that, and reaching them through the platforms that they are reachable through, which is different than the way you reach boomers. Okay, and one other number that I'll give you is another current political issue, the DREAM Act. Should we provide a path of citizenship, especially for those young people who came to this country through, wasn't their decision, they came as children, and should we provide citizenship for those folks? Again, boomers are split on that issue. Millennials are strongly in favor. So different political views. Okay. I don't want to, extend too long. Let me then, kind of move to where Taylor takes us in this book and what he asks us to consider. He establishes these enormous gaps and differences between these generations, everything from gender roles, attitudes towards government, religiosity, views towards immigration, methods of even the consumption of news we were talking about before we started, whereas boomers continue to still get their news from archaic vehicles like the newspaper. I have a meeting this afternoon with Rex Smith over at the TU. Whereas millennials say things like, I don't have an appointment with the newspaper. If it's important, it'll find me. News finds me, they say. News finds them because they're on Facebook, they're on Twitter, they're in communication with their friends and colleagues. News finds them. Our habit, for those of us who still enjoy sitting down with a newspaper in the morning, especially on a Sunday morning, and reading the newspaper cover to cover, or that incredibly archaic tradition of watching the 6:30 news. Come on, be honest, how many people watch the 6:30 news? Okay. Again, if we had a room full of millennials, that would be almost unheard of. Okay, so with all these differences, when we consider the social contract that exists in our nation, the agreements that we have made as a society, Taylor then asks, will that persist? Do we need, as a society, do we need to reach out to our elected leaders to consider a revamping, a rewriting, a modernization of the social contract? So Taylor writes, come the inevitable day when the entitlement programs for seniors are trimmed, families will have to reclaim some of the caregiving ground that they've surrendered to the state. Okay? So Taylor's view is that given that the dependency rate, which is a figure that looks at how many people are in the workforce as against how many people are either too young to be in the workforce or retired from it. That's where the danger is. When Social Security started, there were 42 workers for every one person receiving benefits. 42 to 1. 42 to 1. I remember my grandfather lived to be 101. He contributed to the Social Security system 1 year. And then he collected and collected and collected. He thought this was the greatest country that was imaginable, right? So right now, we're at 2 to 1. And we're moving towards 1 to 1. Some people argue as much as 3 to 1 right now. So call it 3 to 1 right now. The rate of people contributing to the rate of people receiving benefits appears to be unsustainable. Now, is the family going to work? Are we going to switch to a system where, as in some nations, and Pew does this, and you can look at these numbers in Taylor's book, when you ask people, who do you think should be responsible for taking care of people who have legitimate needs in your society? Should it be, it's up to them? Or should it be their family? Or should it be the government? Now, there are some European nations, social democracies, who an overwhelming percentage will say, well, it'll still be the government. The United States right now is really kind of evenly split. We still have a sense that each of us should have planned for our own retirement and should take care of ourselves. We still look to the government for some support, and to a lesser degree, we think families should help out. But one of the ideas that Taylor considers is, will the family as an institution be strong enough, vibrant enough to make up any slack that starts to occur if and when the Social Security system no longer can provide a sufficient safety net? And after entertaining that idea for a while, Taylor comes down to say it's not going to work. It's not going to work. In fact, he says that currently the family as an institution is changing. 40% of children are born in families where there is not a marriage. So he says we are in danger of having a generation of elderly orphans. Another sociologist, Andrew Cherlin, writes, over the course of our lives, we're accumulating more and more kin to whom we owe less and less. We have more and varied relationships, but we owe them less. So we have changing culture, changing family structure, economic difficulties, job insecurity of these millennials. We also know that right now the net worth of older households has increased, but the net worth of millennial households has plummeted. So what are we going to do? This is really where I think Taylor kind of runs out of gas in this book, and this is where he leaves it to us. Here's his solution. Okay, I know you've been waiting for, he's got to give you something, right? What Taylor argues is that we need to look it in the mirror. Number one, he says we need leadership. He puts up FDR on kind of a pedestal, and he says that's the type of leader that we need. He credits FDR with really brilliance in designing Social Security, convincing people that they were contributing and that this was a contributory pension plan, when in reality it was a redistribution of wealth plan. So, I'm sure, and maybe people in this room have said it, hey, I paid in all those years, I deserve to get it back, right? That's a sentiment that you'll hear. In reality, most boomers are going to receive far more than they ever paid. Boomers are going to come out very well. When you add together Social Security, consider life expectancy, and you look at Medicare, most boomers are going to get far more out than they put in. Millennials are not to expect that. So Taylor says there needs to be political leadership that strives for intergenerational equity.
You're not going to get it now.
He argues that the ultimate answer that we need to come to is one really of a certain level of shared pain. That each generation owes it, he says, to every succeeding generation to, in effect, pay their own way. And for one generation to benefit while another generation is left holding the tab is simply an unsustainable situation. Specifically, what is the immediate prognosis in his view? He agrees. He doesn't see the leadership at this point. He shares the frustration that this is a question that's a long-term question that that we as a society face, that we seem unable to even take the first baby step towards resolving. He does not argue in favor of means testing. He argues that, in fact, if you instituted means testing relative to Social Security, that means testing, he says, would just make for mean politics. So he's not really arguing that. What he is arguing is to put everything on the table, to demand new leadership that is forward-thinking rather than thinking towards the very next election. And I know as soon as you say that, you go, well, that's not going to happen. That's crazy. They don't do that. Well, Taylor, unfortunately, despite the fact that he claims to be an optimist, is really kind of putting a, I don't want to call it a doomsday scenario on the table, but he puts a hard dose of reality on the table, that unless we get bailed out by a technological revolution that generates such significant economic vibrancy that a small ratio of people can produce enough economic vitality to support a ever-increasing bubble of long-living boomers, unless that happens, a reckoning will take place. And he argues in favor of seeking to come to that reckoning more so, or to whatever degree, on our terms rather than on crisis terms. So, you know, it's funny, I finished reading the book and I said, you know, you can kind of look at this in a few different ways. And that's part, you know, and I kind of experienced a challenge as I was thinking about coming here and speaking to you in that way. One way you look at it is personally, right? Well, what about me? And you analyze that, and then you sort of breathe easy for a second, because you know, I just turned 60 this year, and so for someone my age, knowing what the political power of my generation is, chances are I and my colleagues are just fine. The system will continue to work and will compensate me to the extent that I expect. And that I personally will be fine. But then the other way of looking at it is, well, what about us? What about, you know, my kids, my grandkids, and what about the nation in which we are nested? So each of us, as a voter, as a participatory member of our society, we can take solace in just saying, I can close my front door, and the check's going to come, and everything is fine. And to what extent am I going to say, I demand that my politicians address this. I demand that we be honest with what our economic reality is. I demand that we're going to run a country to some extent. Politicians love to say this, right? You know, you got to run the budget like you would run your family budget. Well, how long would you stick your head in the sand with your family? It catches up to you pretty quickly. So, you know, I think that I walked away from Taylor's book with an appreciation of the size of the challenge, and a thoughtfulness that I think each one of us has to decide whether there's nothing I can do about it, I'll take my check and move on, or is there something that we can do a little bit? Is there one letter that we can write? Is there one conversation that we can have with a friend, with a neighbor? What is it that we can possibly do to overcome this frustration of political inaction and seek to spur it a little bit? I know I'm a wild-eyed idealist. I've always been that way, you know. But I just refuse to believe that it is without merit to attempt to hold our political system responsible. And ultimately, that's what I walk away from Taylor with. So I'm happy to take any questions. Yes?